when wrongful convictions happen or cases go bad, it's just not the one bad actor, because typically they think that they're doing the right thing at the time based on the information they have, but there's all these other factors that come into place. It's like an airplane crash. You can blame the pilot, but there's usually a bunch of other errors. Not only that the pilot did, but the errors within the system that allowed him to do these things or made him do these things because of timings, things along that line.
Systemic failures.
Yes.
Things that could be fixed.
Things that can be fixed, and oftentimes aren't, especially in law enforcement, because when these things happen, we tend to kind of hunker down and become very defensive, and we don't want to study. That's starting to change. I mean, there's programs out there where they're trying to get law enforcement to do these big comprehensive reviews, but it's very slow going.
I mean, law enforcement in general has been kind of resistant to any sort of reform.
We're resistant to anything that we think is going to make us look bad.
Right.
And that's, I mean, it's so funny when in the past, one thing I've learned when you're testifying, if you make a mistake or if you made a mistake during the investigation or whatever, admit to it. And the juries love it, because here's this guy up here who's not being defensive, who's saying, yeah, I made a mistake. And you just come across as being much more honest, much more open, and much more believable. But I still do a lot of teaching with law enforcement, and I do a lot of reviews of their policies and procedures. And typically, behind closed doors, I mean, there's always a few people who think that I'm full of it.
Right.
But behind closed doors, cops want to get it right. They don't want to make a mistake. They don't want to send the wrong person to jail. And so they're really interested in what I have to say. And in fact, I remember the first time I gave a presentation, it was at a cold case conference, and there was a woman from the LA Sheriff's Department Homicide Unit. She'd been with them for like 30 some years. And she's sitting in the front row, and she's really looks very defensive and angry and all that. And I'm going, I'm not selling this at all. But afterwards, she ran right up to me, put her finger right in my face, and she told me, if anybody out here tells you that they haven't done the same thing that you did, they're lying. She said, I wish I'd had this, I wish I knew this 30 years ago.
Wow.
And I'm going, wow, that's pretty good. So, yeah, if I'm testifying in a case where they're involved, they typically don't like what I have to say. But in that sort of environment, like I said, they want to get it right.
And while interrogation is one of your main things that you focus on, you've also had experience with dealing with confidential informants.
Yes, because when you get information from a confidential informant, it's like any other witness or even a confession. You have to determine its reliability. And so there's a step-by-step procedure to kind of do that. And oftentimes it's not done. Or, so that's what I talk about when I have a case that involves a confidential informant. Did law enforcement do due diligence to make sure that that information came from the source that the informant said that it came from? And is it reliable?
What are some of the main issues you see in the criminal justice system when they're using confidential informants? There's probably more than one. There's probably a lot.
The biggest one is, well, there's a couple that kind of come together. Usually when a confidential informant pops up, especially like jailhouse stitches and things like that, they come forward when we're having problems with a case. It's a very difficult case, we're having issues with it and all that. And then suddenly they're there and they're giving us information that we really want. And so we're kind of much more willing to accept it and turn a blind eye to some of the red flags. The other thing about informants is that it's a very common thing. We fall in love with them. We become their buddy. And when you're friends with somebody, it's much easier for that person to be able to manipulate you, and can take advantage of that relationship, and that happens a whole lot as well.
And the use of criminal informants, sometimes it's somebody who's just volunteering information for whatever reason. Maybe they get money out of it. Maybe they've got a criminal case that they're going to get off of. But it seems like there are contracts with district attorneys' offices when somebody gets in trouble, and then they, like specifically to this case we're going to talk about, where they said, okay, you got busted for this amount of drugs. You bring us 3 more good cases, and your trouble goes away. What kind of problems exist with that type of working relationship?
Well, the thing about that is that's how you build cases. You start small and then you work your way up. And law enforcement, there's been a lot of major cases that have been cracked because of informants that would never have been, cracked before, because informants are oftentimes able to get into places that we cannot. So they're useful, they're important, but the problem is it's like a person who's being interrogated. The reason they confess is because they're looking for a benefit, and the informant, especially if they're facing a lot of jail time, they're under a huge amount of pressure to provide information, and if they can't, then oftentimes they will make it up. They'll create something that isn't there. And so that's the real danger right there. And you really have to be on your toes, and you really have to check and double check what they're telling you and what they're doing for you. And there are systems in place for that, but like with everything else, we have a tendency to work around safeguards that might be in place. I don't think this case was built on the informant's testimony per se as to what the informant did.
Right.
And then actually the case was built on what the informant did, and then it was technically corroborated by them going into the house and finding the stuff. So the informant never made it into court, would never have come to court, typically in these cases. The whole case that would be presented before the jury would be the search warrant and what they found right there. Well, that was part of the wording that I saw in the search warrant that kind of raised some red flags for me. Just how kind of ambivalent they were about this guy's track record. But of course, the control by is the main thing right there. And this is how your control by is supposed to go. You come to me, you tell me that you can buy drugs out of this location. I search you, I make sure that there's no money on you, no drugs or anything along that line. I then watch you go to that location, come from that location. So you're under observation the entire time. At that point, I take the drugs from you, I search you again to make sure that you, of course, didn't save any, and then off you go. So I can testify that, you went into the house with nothing, you came back with something. And so that's kind of like a safeguard. Now, one of two things happened here. Either that didn't happen, and he was able to get the drugs into the house during that control buy, or he went back later and planted the drugs after the control buy right there. However, from my understanding, the defendants in this case never mentioned him ever coming by to begin with the first time. And if they weren't selling drugs to begin with, then how would he have gotten the drugs for the control buy?
My understanding of it is, in reading it, is he didn't go to that house to buy drugs. They just took him somewhere and said, give me some methamphetamine to prove your credentials that you can identify what meth is and you can buy it.
That's the other thing. In reading it, you're really not sure if he bought drugs from that house. But it kind of leads you to believe, when you first skim it, that yeah, he did a control buy. But it's really not clear. And to me, I mean, as a supervisor, I would have wanted that to be clear. I bought drugs from this house, and who I bought drugs from that house, and the judge. Somebody should have picked up on that.
Right.
But so often we use this boilerplate language in these search warrants, and they're almost rubber stamped.
Mm-hmm.
As long as certain language is in there, it's just okay. You're good to go. And nobody's really scrutinizing this stuff very carefully.
You would like to see the judge who's signing off on this ask a couple more questions, perhaps?
With that paragraph that I saw, yeah, I would go, wait a minute, this is not clear. You need to make this clear. Because, like I said, I got the impression that when I first read it, that, yeah, there was a controlled buy from the house, but when you're at a deeper dive, you go, wait a minute, it's not really saying that. You don't get that sense right there.
Right. And just your perceptions of other issues that you've seen in reviewing this case and how it kind of went down.
Oh, what I thought was interesting, well, that was the main thing right there. But everything else was your typical drug search warrant. I mean, it's kind of like buy the book. This is how it's done. You get the drugs and you move on. I didn't see any real follow-up investigation or any initial investigation to kind of see whether or not there's anything that might have, outside of the informant's information, that might have indicated that these people were major meth dealers. What I also found interesting was, you want to go up the ladder.
Yes, that was my next question.
That's the thing. You want to go up the ladder.
Right. And
he's given up people on the same level as him.
End users, basically.
Yes. Or if he's supplying and they're supplying, well, who are they getting it from? That's nice that you can give me these people, but who are you getting it from? Because that's what I really want. If you have a source that has a proven track record, oftentimes you can get a search warrant based on their word alone, with corroboration of what they're telling you from other sources. It's a much stronger case. So, but in this case, he had a contract. All I got to do is give you two cases, that's it. And so rather than use him to build up his reliability and then go after the big guy, they just took two other similar level people off the street.
Right.
And that's just a stat game.
Right, because he was essentially arrested for the same amount of drugs that he ended up turning in, the 3 at the one house and then the 1 at the other house. So 4 people who were basically users were now felony level drug traffickers.
Yeah, and the other thing is that what I found interesting was that it was the same amount that he got caught with.
Yes.
And so he had to give them at least that amount. And that's kind of a little red flag too. Right. He had to give them somebody on the same level as him. Now, if he has to go and get those drugs himself in order to set these people up, which of course he had to, why spend any more money than you have to get out of jail free, sort of thing. Right. You're not gonna get 500 grams because you don't need to.
Right.
Just keep it at that level.
And that's kind of one of our lingering questions is, where does this guy who gets busted for a huge amount of methamphetamine, which he obviously paid for at some point, right? He bought those drugs and
right.
was going to distribute them. Where does he then turn around and get nearly $200,000 worth of methamphetamine to plant in that house and then in another house without somebody coming to kill him because he's now lost $600,000 worth of drugs?
That's a good question. A plea negotiation is just like what happens in the interrogation room. The cops are telling them, look, with the evidence that we have, you can go to jail for life. But if you confess, then the judge will be lenient, and this is, good things will happen. The prosecutor's going, look, with the evidence that we have, it's, you're going to have a hard time with this. You may win. Odds are you're not. So if you want to take your chances, fine. If not, here's a good deal. Plea bargains are nothing more than business propositions, business deals. It's a cost-benefit analysis that they're doing. And so that's why you get a lot of people who falsely confess to crimes that they didn't commit as part of a plea deal.
Right.
You know, they just know, they, they just don't want to take the chance of going to trial because it's a crapshoot a lot of times.
And I mean, there's a level of coercion there, isn't there? I mean, the prosecutor wants to make this case, he wants to get it off his desk, move it along, right?
Well, the thing about it is the things that I was talking about that happens in the interrogation room, you know, really you're not supposed to make any kind of real or implied threats or promises right there. So, you know, typically we dance around that sort of stuff. The prosecutor is not bound by that. The prosecutor can make threats, and he can follow through with those threats, and he can follow through with the promises. So it is much more coercive on the prosecutor's part because they're allowed free rein. You know, go for it.
Why do innocent people admit to things that they didn't do?
Because they feel like it's only option. It's their only option. They feel like they have this temporary perception that in order to escape a real or perceived consequence, an inevitable consequence, so that's jail time, and to receive a real or perceived benefit, such as leniency from the judge and all that, that all they got to do is say this. And we're very skilled at, you know, blocking out. We're just like master high-pressure salesmen. We give them these two options. It's one or the other, one or the other. That's it. And you only have right now to take it. Because if you walk out the room, everything's off the table, and this is what's going to happen to you.
Right. And for somebody who's never been in trouble with the law, it's hard for them to understand why somebody would do something like that until you find yourself in that situation.
Especially people who trust authority. You know, believe it or not, the more you trust police officer, and I'm telling you, look, I can't lie to you about the evidence. We have 3 witnesses who saw you do it, and they picked you out of a photo spread. Now, all that's a lie.
Right.
But, you know, I can't lie to you about that or I'll go to jail. That's also a lie, you know, as well. And so you believe that these 3 witnesses are mistaken, but you're screwed. And, you know, the only way that you can get any kind of help, because he's telling you he wants to help you. You know, oh, I want to help you through this, but you got to, you know, this is what you got to tell me. It's even gotten, some of the cases that I've worked, and it's temporary, but people actually come to believe that they did commit the crime. But it's because they're either they come to the conclusion, well, he's telling me that I got all these witnesses, maybe I blacked out, or even the detective may suggest that they had a blackout, or they suppress the memory and that sort of thing. And so it's called, it's basically called a internalized false confession, because you come to believe that it's a possibility that you committed it.
Why is it important for the viewer here to learn a lesson from this, that we're focusing on it? Why do you think that it's important to focus on this kind of stuff?
Law enforcement's job is really simple. We're going to get the right person, but we got to do it the right way. When you start fudging on the right way, you're going to eventually get the wrong person right there. Now, yeah, these people were drug users. Maybe they should go to jail for that. But the way that they were caught was definitely the wrong way. We have these rules in place for a reason, and that's to protect people. And, you know, what's to say that this informant or some other informant could just go plant drugs on anybody on the street? That's why it's important. We have to, once we start skipping, once we go rogue and we don't follow the rules, we're going to catch up a lot of innocent people are going to get caught up in this dragnet for the sake of law and order.
Right. And are we really stopping drugs?
Yeah, we're not doing anything along that line. Yeah, I mean, it's like cops who say, well, if he didn't do this, he did something else. Yeah. No, your job is to get him for what he did, not for, you know, not for some made up stuff. Yeah. That's what your real job is.
That's policing in a perfect world.
Well, but don't you? I mean, that's the minimum.
Right.
That's not a perfect world. That's the bare minimum, right there. So
Yeah.
that's my feeling on it.